Hey everyone, this week we are going to be playing with the CDC Whip deck that John Farrell used to win the Open last weekend in Atlanta. It's a deck that has been around for a while, but much like is the case with a lot of the decks in Standard, there wasn't really a consensus best list. Like, there are people like Willie Adel who've been working on the deck a lot, and it's done well in some Grand Prix, especially the one over in Europe that Big Z won. But no one has ever been like, all right, this is like the best list of this version or the best list of this deck. So I think this list kind of looks like it might be that, where it mostly just plays like all the max amounts of the good cards, and maybe that's right, maybe it's wrong. I don't know. Like things like 4 Hornet Queen, 4 Whip of Erebos. Those cards are both kind of clunky, and the case with the Hornet Queen, like you don't really have you don't have a from hand discard outlet. You can't like careful study it or faithless looting it away or whatever. So if it's in your hand, it's stuck there, and I can't imagine that this deck casts Hornet Queen fast enough of the time to actually make you want to play it as a 4 of. But as far as when you're milling yourself, you definitely want to hit it. So I can understand that. As for Whip of Erebos, it seems like that's the card that you just always want, and it doesn't really matter what else is going on as long as you just have a whip. You don't really care about drawing multiples, because if you have multiples, that means you probably have one, and then there are some decks that can actually kill them, so drawing multiples is good. So 4 whips actually seems correct. A little skeptical about the 4 Hornet Queens, and I'm pretty skeptical about actually not having 4 Murderous Cuts. That's kind of weird, but so I think this deck overall does a pretty good job of what it's doing, which is just milling itself and then either taking advantage of that with CDC or Whip of Erebos. And in the meantime, you're kind of like this mid-rangey deck, like sort of Abzani. You have like the Coursers, the Caryatids, you have reasonable defensive things, you have Murderous Cut to go with all the self-mill stuff, and then your late game is either just like making a bunch of bees, which is very tough for people to deal with, or you put them in this sort of like semi-soft lock with like Doomwake Giant, Soul of Innistrad, Farika, where going long, you're just milling yourself a bunch, but eventually you're going to find a Soul, and then that can get you Doomwake and Farika, and then you can use Farika to keep activating Doomwake Giant, or you just get multiple Doomwakes, and then you have, the soft lock going where they basically just like can't play creatures, or if they play creatures, they're going to die. So this deck, as far as, the other mid-range decks or the other creature decks in the format, I think this deck does one of the best jobs of winning the long game and ensuring that once you get to the long game, you actually have it locked up, which is pretty nice. It's a nice thing to have, where it's just like, well, if my deck is doing its thing and your deck is doing its thing, like my deck is a significant favorite and it's going to be very difficult for you to win. Like, there's certainly a pretty big advantage to having that going for you. And then I think the points of contention are the whips, the Hornet Queens, how many Doomwakes. Like, some only play 2. This deck has 3. It has like a little bit more of a higher emphasis on them, which might seem kind of strange because there are just straight black-green versions that have Eidolon Blossoms, and they have that to go along with the Doomwakes, and I think that deck is pretty neat too. But Sidisi allows you to play kind of this different game where you just jam this on turn 3, and then you get to play like a Murderous Cut on the first guy, and then play another threat. You actually have them under a pretty big clock, whereas the Eidolon Blossoms deck like basically never puts your opponent on a clock. They're almost always just playing for the long game, trying to eke out some card advantage and win eventually. But this deck has a different avenue, and it ends up milling itself a lot harder too because of the presence of Sidisi. And the 3-color mana base, when you're just splashing a single card, is not that much worse than playing straight green-black anyway. So I don't think the mana is too bad as long as you don't stretch it super far. If we were playing like some blue 2-drops and like a bunch of things with like a lot of blue mana symbols, then it'd be kind of tough. But we're actually just splashing this one card, so it's not a big deal. And 2 Elvish Mystics might look kind of strange, but there are Caryatids for acceleration, and Elvish Mystic in a deck with a bunch of ETB tap lands is kind of awkward, where either you can't play it on turn 1, or you can, but it just means that you have an ETB tap land somewhere down the line where it means that the Elvish Mystic is not going to accelerate you properly. So it is certainly possible to build this deck in such a way to maximize Elvish Mystic, where you just end up playing a bunch of pain lands. Like, you could play Yevmai Coast, Llanowar Waste, Mana Confluence, some forests, and you would have a good mana base that could always cast Elvish Mystic on turn 1, but you would also take a bunch of damage. So you'd also not have like the utility of the Scrylands. So there's a delicate balance here, you know, and I think we've seen a lot of these mid-range decks with just 2 Elvish Mystics, whether it's some of the Abzan decks from the Pro Tour, or some of these whip decks, or, you know, some decks just like okay, you know, these Mystics are like kind of high variance. Sometimes they're good, sometimes you draw it on turn 10 and they're really bad. So I'll just cut those entirely and play 24 lands, and that's what Glenn Jones did with his Abzan Reanimator deck. And I'm not sure which I like, really. You know, when you're playing things like Sidisi, you kind of want more accelerants. So I could totally see playing some Elvish Mystics or 0, whatever. It's just I think it adds another dimension to the deck, which would otherwise be kind of lacking, where you actually have more accelerants and can get these faster draws. And with something like Sidisi, you can actually take advantage of that, whereas like hard ramping into Eidolon of Blossoms is actually just not that impressive. And other than that, the main deck is pretty reasonable, and I like that John just looked at these lists and picked the cards that were the best and just played the most of them. And aside from only 3 Murderous Cuts, I think this is basically what that deck looks like, and that's pretty nice. This feels like mostly optimized. Could be kind of tuned a little bit, you know, maybe you don't want as many queens, maybe you don't need as many Doomwake Giants, maybe you do want the 4th cut, or, you know, maybe the 3rd commune is too much, you know, things like that. But other than that, like, this deck looks good, and this deck has been putting up pretty reasonable numbers, and it just outright won the last tournament. So this is almost certainly a deck to be looking out for in the next couple weeks. As for the sideboard, it's kind of weird, and I haven't played a ton with this deck, so things like Ashiok looks to me like, okay, it could come in the Whip Mirrors and probably be very, very good in those matchups, but do you bring it in against control decks? Probably. It's like this 3-mana threat that's tough for them to deal with, but if they're playing stuff like Perilous Vault, then it just kind of gets caught up with everything else and doesn't seem all that impressive. So aside from the mirror-ish type matches, I'm not entirely sure where this comes in. Maybe it's supposed to come in against actual Abzan and be fine there. Reclamation Sage is pretty good against the mirror matches where, you know, something like Abzan might have 4 coursers. Maybe they have a couple Banishing Lights on their sideboard, and then maybe you bring in a Sage or 2. But for the mirror matches, like, Sage is just the king. It feels like there's Whips and Doomwakes and all these things, and Sage just smashes all of them. And then if you can trade it away in combat somehow, you can always also whip it back, or if you know, just mill into it. It's just, it makes it so they can't assemble their soft lock, and having a decent amount of Sages to ensure that that doesn't really happen to you is probably a pretty smart idea. Other than that, a couple of negates, 3 Thoughtseizes, Liliana Vest, all for control decks, and I feel like decks like this are pretty weak to a bunch of sweepers plus some sort of way to remove whip. If they have like End Hostilities and or Anger of the Gods, it seems kind of difficult, because a lot of the time you're trying to assemble this board position and, you know, develop your mana with these mana creatures and whatnot, and then you just get wrathed, and you just get set too far back because you're probably not able to play Whip of Erebos and activate it in the same turn. And then, you know, they have this turn where, like, you play Whip and they can either counter it, or if they were tapped out, like after a sweeper or something, they can just untap and deal with it. And then you're just not doing anything very threatening. So I definitely like having the negates, the Thoughtseizes to stop those sweepers. Perilous Vault, also fairly problematic because it just kills everything, including your whips. Liliana Vest, probably not too much specific that you need to be tutoring for, although I can definitely see board states where you play this and just want to tutor up negate to make it so they don't have any outs, so that might be good, but Liliana might not be necessary. Then Drown in Sorrows, and I'm surprised I only see like 2 Drowns as cards that are there for straight beatdown decks, but that indicates to me that this deck already has a pretty good beatdown matchup. So that's about it. This deck looks pretty good, looks tuned, and should be a lot of fun, so we'll see what happens.